can't
joined
imagine.
by Ari Temkin, Big 12 Radio on TuneIn, joining us on 365 Sports. Ari, you like that?
Paul, don't sell yourself short. You look just like Adam Levine.
yeah.
They both have nice hair. All right, Ari, 9 of 16 teams still alive, some obviously with a direct route to AT&T Stadium, Iowa State, Arizona State. Kansas is as hot as anybody. Baylor's won 5 in a row, but let's focus in on the top and how this has been a grind to get in this position for everybody that still has a chance.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild. Just start with Arizona State for a team that came into this conference with the expectations where they were after 3 wins. You know, they lose some of the key pieces to that 3-win team last year, and you're wondering, well, they turn over a roster. How good can they be? I mean, I don't know about you, but I picked Arizona State along with Houston to be at the bottom of the conference, and certainly didn't pick Utah and Oklahoma State to be at the bottom of the conference. So, I mean, it's sort of been the inverse of what we expected. And as you mentioned, Baylor and Kansas playing on Saturday. These are 2 of the hottest teams in college football. Kansas, you know, to me, what happened between Kansas and Colorado on Saturday, like, you know, you said all week, you shouldn't be overlooking Kansas. They're playing hot. They're playing as well as, you know, people expect them to play when the season started. And yet, despite that, it appears Colorado has overlooked Kansas. So to me, that's coaching. I mean, Deion's done a great job all year, but how do you not have your team ready to play when it was obvious that this could be kind of a trap spot for them, and they just overlooked them? I mean, I think Kansas won convincingly on both lines of scrimmage. Colorado had been able to really make hay defensively by their pass rush, and it was nowhere to be seen in this game. I think the Kansas offensive line absolutely manhandled that Colorado defensive line, and then, once again, Colorado could not run the football. So, in some ways, all of these teams are kind of going through baptism by fire and wondering, who comes out the other end based on the ability to play a lot of different styles. And maybe that's a good thing in terms of trying to get teams to, be in good position to win playoff games. But it's wild. The only thing I said before the season started was we know Utah is not going to win the conference simply because the teams that are favored to win the conference don't win this conference. That's just how this league is. I think the difference, though, guys, is this is a league of parity. But so too is the SEC. I mean, look at what happened on Saturday with the SEC. But yet the way in which, and you were just playing some of this with some of those memes, the way in which we discussed the SEC relative to the Big 12 it's totally different. But when you've got a 500 Oklahoma team beating Alabama at home and only holding them to 3 points, and Auburn, who's been dead all year, beats Texas A&M, who's one of the top teams in the SEC. I mean, I think that says a lot about where that conference is. So, as much as people want to dress it up as something different, we're seeing a lot of parity across college football, and we really haven't ever seen anything like this, especially in modern history. There's always been teams at the top that have been consistent winners in college football, and we're not seeing that right now.
Why is the SEC, the SEC to me, Ari, seems to welcome the parity on one side, but they're also scared of admitting that there's parity on the other, because if they have to admit it, they have to admit that there's parity in the other leagues too.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And look, I mean, nobody's under any impression that the SEC is not better than the Big 12. I want to make sure that I say that pretty clearly. Like the SEC is clearly a better conference than the Big 12. But I think the difference is, in many ways, how we used to describe it is, well, the SEC is so top heavy and there's, legitimate national title contenders at the top. And I don't think it's that top heavy anymore. There's as much parity in the league as there is in the Big 12. And so I think that's where the rubber meets the road here. Are some of these teams better than Big 12 teams on the whole? Yeah, absolutely. I think top to bottom. But and look, that's obvious by there's only 2 teams in the SEC that are not going to be in a bowl game. So whereas opposed to in the Big 12, there's 9 teams. If Kansas beats Baylor on Saturday and Cincinnati beats TCU on Saturday, then there's going to be 11 bowl teams. But if both of those teams lose, then you only have 9 of 16 are bowl teams. Whereas in the SEC, you have Mississippi State and Kentucky are the 2 teams that are not going to go bowling this year. So, again, just sort of what we're talking about here. Nobody's under the impression, or I'm not under the impression, that the SEC is not better than the Big 12. It's just the way that the Big 12 gets discussed is, well, it's a league of parity and it's mid because of that. I think in the same way that the SEC is not mid because of that, the same thing is true for the Big 12. The Big 12 has a lot of different teams that play different styles that are difficult to prepare for on a week in, a week out basis. Baylor's been one of the best offenses in college football, if not the best offense in college football the last month of the season. And Kansas is playing as good as any team in college football right now. So I think a part of it is the psychology of the schedule. When did you get teams? That plays a huge factor in here. I mean, coming into the season, you looked at Kansas's schedule before the season started. You would have thought it was an easy schedule. They avoided Utah. They didn't have Oklahoma State. Never would have thought that missing those teams this year would have been a disaster for a team. Instead, they got Arizona State, BYU, Iowa State, Colorado. I mean, Baylor. There are 5 better teams in the conference than those 5 who Kansas had to play all this season. So part of it too, I think, is just expectations based on preseason. And like when you look at Kansas, some of these other schedules, it's been difficult to gauge who's going to win week in and week out.
So, Ari, the most straightforward path is Arizona State wins, Iowa State wins. It's Arizona State versus Iowa State. If those two things don't happen, then BYU has the door open up, or Colorado, or any other number of teams. Just what do you think of just this fall here at the end by BYU? Still a very good team, but man alive, like it's right there. You're cruising, and then these 2 stumbling blocks, and now we're in the last week, and it's suddenly not even in your control any longer.
Yeah, and look, I mean, they've been really, really good all year, but I mean, Jake Retzloff, he's just not been good enough in these last 2 games, quite frankly. And I hate to say that because he's had a really good season, and he's, from where he was last year to where he is this year is night and day. But I mean, Kansas takes a lead a couple of weeks ago against BYU with basically the entire fourth quarter, and BYU has multiple drives that they cannot find the end zone. And I put that on the quarterback. At some point, your quarterback has to make plays. In the game on Saturday against Arizona State, before Retzloff threw the interception that should have sealed the game, but didn't because of what Dillingham decided to do at the end of that game. The pass before that interception, he missed JoJo Phillips streaking down the sideline for what would have been a go-ahead touchdown. And he just missed him flat out. It was wide open behind the defense, just missed him. And like you can't do that. It's an unforgiving sport. When you have those opportunities, you have to take care of them. In the kicking game, you got to pretty much be 100%. And while quarterbacks are not going to be that high of a percentage in terms of completion, when you have those opportunities down the field, you got to hit them. And he didn't. So, and I think with BYU, I put it on the quarterback. When I look at those 4 teams, if I'm power ranking the quarterbacks, Retzloff is last to me. And a lot of that has to do with how he's played of late. So I think from a Big 12 perspective, it's probably best case scenario here that BYU has played this way, because now you get an opportunity for, these 3 other teams and potentially more with a really good quarterback situation in order to, give the Big 12 their best shot at winning a playoff game.
Yeah, there's no question he was running free right there inside, the 15 or 10-yard line, and just a simple throw, but it's easier because we don't know what else would be going through his mind, but that would have been an unbelievable win if BYU would not have allowed anything at the end of the game. What are your thoughts about what Lance Leipold has done at KU after where they were? They have played a very difficult schedule. They do end up on the road, but all of a sudden they have just tormented so many teams in the Big 12.
Yeah, I mean, they're the first team in college football history to be under 500 and have 3 straight wins against top 25 teams. It's remarkable. As a KU alum and fan myself, you can't help but wonder what might have been this season. I've seen them classified as one of the most unlucky teams in college football. And I'm sure as you guys dig in to do your previews this week, you'll see that too. I look at it a completely different way, guys. They were not unlucky. These are not unlucky bounces that went against them. Certainly there are instances of that, but Jalen Daniels was not good enough earlier this year. Way too many turnovers, just too many mistakes made by the quarterback. So it's hard for me to look at this team and say you were unlucky. I think they made their bed. They had to lie in it. That was just how they were. They could not score at the end of halves. They could not score at the end of games. They turned the ball over way too much, especially quarterback. The difference between the last, let's say, 5 weeks and the first 5 weeks have been Jalen Daniels. Jalen Daniels has been as good, in this stretch as he was, when he was named the preseason Big 12 Player of the Year and when he helped lead Kansas to an 8-win season and a loss, to Arkansas in their bowl game a few years ago. Jason Bean last year stepped in and played really well, but Daniels was hurt all year. And then he stepped in this year and played really badly. I mean, and I think it was a combination of, Grimes figuring out the play calling situation and the quarterback, having mistakes. But there were games like Kansas has had one of the best rushing attacks all season. And there were games earlier this year where Grimes avoided the running the football when they were running at 5 to 6 7 yards a clip. Like there was a game earlier this season with Devin Neal running at 7 yards a clip, and they kept throwing the football down the stretch, and that's why they lost. It was just inexcusable. So I think it was a combination of, Jeff Grimes not exactly having the full scope of how he should call plays, especially in a game when you've got a guy that's running the ball as well as they are, and then the quarterback making too many mistakes. So again, I mean, they're classified as an unlucky team. To me, they're not unlucky. They made their own unluck, and now we see them do the opposite, like the punt by Jalen Daniels. They practiced that against BYU. Like suddenly they're making their own luck because they're making the right plays. But it's so bizarre to look at them because like they're one of the best red zone offenses in college football. They have one of the best running games in college football. They have, like one of the best third down percentages in college football. Like it's crazy that their record is 5-6, despite being like top 10 in some of these major categories that normally define like the best teams in college football. It's bizarre.
Yeah, Grimes can be a frustrating experience because we saw him here for 3 years.
Right.
But like when he's in his bag and he's got the right toys, like it can be beautiful, man. And I think you saw some of that
Right.
Saturday in the last few.
And we're seeing that now. You're exactly right, Craig. Like that's exactly what we're seeing right now. And I mean, midway through the season, like there's no way they're bringing Jeff Grimes back. And now it's like, oh yeah, we see like they just needed a little bit of time together. And unfortunately, there's no preseason or there's nobody cares about that stuff. You got to hit the ground running in college football, and that's why Kansas is where they are. They were 2-6, had to win out against one of the toughest schedules, probably the toughest schedule in college football in order to get to a bowl game, and here they're in the midst of doing that. But it would be so Kansas in 2024 to lose this game on Saturday.
No, God.
Ari, I wanted to go back to what you said about Kenny Dillingham's clock management at the end of that game. Like he clearly outthought himself to the very end, and I kept going, all right, if I'm going to give them the ball back, potentially, I'd rather have them have the ball, just me kneeling it down with 7 seconds left at the 7-yard line than with 1 second left at midfield, which is what happened. Then the officials got all that wrong, and that was just chaos. What happened? It's like nobody ever knew about Tempe and drunk kids before, but they got all that wrong, and it was a mess. But that almost completely undid Arizona State, and as great of a young coach as Kenny Dillingham is, and I think he's going to run the league at some point because he is that good. He really outthought himself there, didn't he?
Yeah. And look, I mean, the second half of that game too, in the first half, Cam Scadaboo had 19 carries for 69 yards and 3 touchdowns. He had 12 carries in the second half for 51 yards and no touchdowns. Now, look, BYU's defense did a much better job in the second half, but I've got a 28-3 lead, and I've got a halfback with 19 carries for 69 yards. He better have at least 19 carries in the second half, especially with a lead. So, like, the fact that he only had 12 carries in the second half was kind of shocking. And again, I know that BYU's defense did better. Like, there was a 3rd and 1 that they stopped him on, and you can count on one hand how many times Cam Scadaboo has been stopped on 3rd and short. But yeah, I just think their approach in the second half on the whole was off. And it wasn't like they sat on the lead. Like, they continued to be aggressive. It wasn't one of those where they weren't aggressive at all with the lead. How are you not run the football more with Cam Scadaboo? And quite frankly, almost exclusively, like I'd almost rather them be a little bit more, passive than aggressive in the second half in terms of their play calling, especially when you've got a guy like Scadaboo who's running the way that he was. But then, yeah, I mean, you get the interception there and the game has to be over. And even if it's not, like, obviously the same situation came down in the Cowboy game, and you had the dude that returned it and Washington let him do it, but that's at a 1-score game. So Washington wanted to keep it a 1-score game, which they did by letting him score. In this situation, you're up 2 scores if you get a touchdown there. So, like, they need to score, get an onside kick, and then score again. The likelihood of that happening versus I have a 5-point lead, and now I'm at midfield, and I give them a Hail Mary opportunity. Like, it's crazy to me. And then after the game, he tried to play it off like it was the right move. Now, today he came out and basically said, no, I made I made a huge mistake. We didn't practice that enough. If we were up by 1, I probably would have taken this approach, but being up by 5, you probably should score to go up 2 scores. It's inexcusable. Like, the backpedaling to take up time, losing yardage. I mean, it was hard to watch. You're watching this like, what is he doing? Like, again, there's 100 ways you can go about managing the end of that game. And I get the thought process of not trying to give them the ball back and trying to waste as much time as possible. But when they have 1 timeout and a minute left, it's far too much time to be losing yardage like that, which again, Like if you're thinking about things that could go wrong if you score, I could think of so many more things that go wrong the way that they played it out. So, and basically none of those things ended up going wrong. I mean, Sam Levitt could have fumbled. They could have had a penalty. They probably should have had a penalty for a grounding on the throwaway on 4th down. They didn't. And then I have no idea how on earth Cam Scadaboo was whistled for a penalty signing an autograph, but somehow, some way their fans weren't whistled after pre-rushing the field. Like that was more egregious than anything else. I could not believe there wasn't a penalty for that.
And by the way, there are videos that I've seen them where Dillingham was just in the grill of the officials.
Oh, he was.
Which, imagine if it would have been a 15-yard unsportsmanlike penalty on top of them taking the snap at midfield. I've seen at a Cowboys training camp where Bill Parcels actually showed that particular play by throwing the ball, but with 7 seconds left, it's almost as if Levitt miscalculated the trajectory and did not throw it quite high enough or even maybe far enough, or maybe that's as far as he could throw it. But, yeah, a lot of things could have happened. It reminded me of Colt McCoy in Nebraska.
Yeah, Nebraska.
When the ball hit the railing. Otherwise, if it goes 2 more feet to the right of the inside the railing, it's over. And, of course, Texas ended up winning the game. But that almost came back to haunt Dillingham in the Sun Devils.
I bet Nebraska fans were looking at that thinking, 1 second.
Yeah.
That's an interesting call. And to echo your point, Smokey, about the Parcells thing, like, I used to work with Dat Wynn, and he talked about that kind of stuff. Like Parcells was the type of coach that would walk you through every end of game situation. And like, I can't remember the specific instance, but there was an end of game situation against the Giants in a game that they had played out in practice. That's like one of the most inconceivable end of game situations. You'd never think it would happen. And it did. And that's like the difference between great coaches and just coaches is having players that understand exactly what to do in every end of game situation. And my NFL team is the Chicago Bears, who lost again in an inexplicable way at the end of the game against the Vikings. And their head coach is now 5-18 in 1-score games. Like, this stuff matters. And it's the coaches that practice this stuff and have teams ready to play at the end of games versus the ones that don't. And the guy that's 5-18 has no idea what he's doing at the end of games, and either does his team.
Ari, I know that a long-suffering Bears fan, I will at least give you credit as someone, you follow the Cowboys and cover them a lot. I'm a long-suffering now Cowboys fan. The Cowboys don't have the decency to be good enough or bad enough. Okay? If they had the decency to really suck and rebuild, that would be something. Or be really good and win a Super Bowl. They don't. At least the Bears have the decency to just stink. Like, that to me is honorable.
But the problem is, like, the Bears are basically the Cowboys without the 90s.
Yeah.
So it's like, and the other thing is, look, there's a lot of good rookie quarterbacks putting up big time numbers this year. I still think Caleb Williams is the best out of this class. I genuinely do. He is an absolute stud. But like, the fact that I'm watching my favorite franchise potentially ruin him is very disheartening. And like, knowing that as good as he is and how many sacks he sustained this year, like they need to hire an alpha coach. And it's like, basically it's been since Mike Ditka that they've had a coach on that level. Maybe Lovey, but it's like they should have hired Jim Harbaugh. Well, of course they should have, but they never would have, because that's not the type of coach that this franchise hires. So I think like part of that, I think Cowboys fans and Bears fans are in a similar boat. And I'd probably rather be a Bears fan simply because of the quarterback situation, but I don't know, because if they ruin him, then we're both at square one.
So Ari, we know the situation going into this weekend. We'll know Arizona and Arizona State, that outcome by the middle of the afternoon as those evening games kick off. So that leaves Farmageddon. Iowa State at home, win and you're in against K-State. Can they avoid fumbling the bag a la Colorado here? What are your thoughts on this matchup, Wildcats and Cyclones, and obviously a big important one for Matt Campbell and company?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like it for Iowa State. I don't know if you guys had a chance to watch back the Iowa State-Utah game, but it was ugly. Yeah. Rocco backed to another pick six on a missed throw that's tipped up into the air. He had another pick in this game. They muffed a punt that was recovered inside the 10, and then had a punt blocked for touchdown. So like, you do any one of those three, and you're probably not beating K-State. you do all three of them in the same game, and I can't believe you still won the game, and they did. But, I mean, it should have never even been close. Utah is so overmatched. As bad as Utah's offense was last year, and it was really bad, it's way worse this year. And then Utah finally got to a quarterback, their fourth quarterback, Luke Batari, who looked pretty good. And you're wondering, why have we seen Isaac Wilson and been exposed to Isaac Wilson this much when Luke Batari can actually, like, complete passes down the field? It was remarkable. So, like, it's a miracle that Iowa State was able to pull that game out, again, considering they had a blocked punt for touchdown, they had a pick six, and muffed a punt inside the 10. Like, you shouldn't win a game where all three of those happen. So, like, and these, unfortunately for Iowa State, not anomalies this year. They've had turnover issues all year. Rocco Becht has had the most pick sixes against him on the season, which normally isn't always the responsibility of the quarterback, but certainly in some of these instances, it is. So, like, you do any of those three against K-State, and you're going to lose. I mean, K-State is playing at a very high level, and here's the difference. What we saw K-State do on Saturday is what we saw them do when they were the best team in the Big 12, which is run Avery Johnson, and then off of that, DJ Giddens is unstoppable. Well, they stopped doing that. Whether it was Avery getting hurt in the Colorado game, they really reined him in, didn't want him running the ball as much, and it showed, and they weren't as good. So now that we've come back and they even said coming out of the game on Saturday, last Saturday, oh, we're going to start to run Avery more. Like, you think that's a good idea? Maybe that's the reason you haven't been as good of late. So I'm glad they finally figured that out. And so it's all these things trending in one way for Iowa State, where you've got Avery running the football consistently and how much that opens the running game for DJ Giddens in K-State, coupled with Iowa State's turnover issues. I'm not very confident in Iowa State this weekend. It's just been far too many turnovers for a team, that 3 weeks ago was undefeated and now just can't get out of its own way.
Ari, thank you, man. Great stuff. I know the week will be great with your show, 7 to 10.
Appreciate you guys.
Big 12 Radio on TuneIn Radio on TuneIn. And we'll know next time we talk with him who will play for the Big 12 championship.